I'm going to admit something that I really haven't told a lot of people. I don't really like most NES games. When I was growing up, I certainly had a Nintendo Entertainment System, but I only had a handful of games and they weren't what you would call classics. Games like Ghostbusters or Legendary Wings were my exposure to the console, with of course Super Mario Bros. Being the bundle-in game. I never got to play the amazing games like Zelda or Metroid, and so I just never really connected with the Nintendo. Fast forward 25 years or so and I'm on a huge retro game kick. I bought some of the old consoles, SNES, Genesis, PlayStation 1 and 2, that kind of thing. I even have a Sega Master System for my 8-bit gaming and I enjoy playing it. Still, I can't get into the original Nintendo home console. There's something that turns me off there, and I honestly think it's a mix of the drab color palette and the brutal arcade cheapness of early home console games. So what does all this credibility-killing confession have to do with anything? Well, today we're going to be talking about a little game that strives to remain true to the NES style while not being crippled by it. This is Odallus: The Dark Call. Released by a small company named Joymasher, an indie team focused on NES-style retro games, Odallus is a Castlevania-style game through and through, from the slower-paced precision combat made famous by the earlier games to the upgrades that provide a dash that reminds me of a certain vampire son from the later games in the series. Many games like this are welcomed on a wave of nostalgia, and this gives them a pass with a lot of people for poor programming, poor AI, poor controls, terrible story, and more. Thankfully, I have no nostalgia for the NES, and so a game like Odallus must stand on its own 2 feet to succeed. The story isn't anything to write home about, with a cutscene in the beginning setting up the basic plot of our rundown hero who must jump back into action to save his family. You'll run into a handful of cutscenes throughout your adventure, usually after major boss fights, and they'll be all Ninja Gaiden style panning camera and text with no voice acting here. You'll also find stone monuments hidden in secret areas throughout the levels that won't give you any kind of in-game benefit, but they will provide more information on the world and its inhabitants. It's more story than a game like this necessarily needs, but what's here is enjoyable and intriguing. An area that will surely divide the audience is the graphics. They've remained faithful to the old NES graphics in many ways, from the color palette to the use of 3 colors and a transparency layer for most sprites. Still, it isn't entirely NES accurate, and the creators do admit it. They aren't trying to hide what they've done. But does it matter that it's not perfectly NES accurate? Absolutely not. The game looks fantastic in its default setting, though I found I preferred the old scanline look which the game thankfully provides. The main character looks fantastic and is well detailed and animated, while the majority of enemies are great in design but somewhat plain in color. This of course is intentional, and contrasting the drab look of most enemies' color palette to the vibrant and often grotesque look of the bosses is a real treat. It makes the player character instantly recognizable on screen and makes boss fights even more epic. The environments are extremely well detailed and a joy to explore, which is a good thing because you'll be doing an awful lot of it. If you're like me, you'll fight your way through the levels and get to the final castle relatively quickly, only to discover that it's locked up tight with magic. You'll need to go back to all the levels and find the branching paths and secrets that will not only let you become more powerful, but eventually open up the final level of the game. This brings us nicely into the combat, and it's where Odallus really shines. As I mentioned before, if you're thinking about Castlevania, you've almost nailed it. You have a main sword attack that has a fairly slow recovery period, so you'll need to plan out each attack in advance. You can cancel most projectile attacks that enemies throw at you simply by slashing them with your sword, and you'll learn which enemies are better to wait until they attack before you make your move, and which you should jump on before they have the chance. In addition to your sword, you'll also pick up multiple sub-weapons, from an axe that flies in a straight line, a torch that hits the ground and sends a small wave of fire forward, and a javelin that has a weird arc but does tremendous damage when it does hit. These all have limited quantities and you can switch between them at will. To replenish these items, you'll find some scattered throughout the levels, but you'll mostly need to purchase them from the merchant. This is also how you'll get most of your extra lives, the problem being that each time you buy an item from the merchant, his vendor prices will increase. The gameplay isn't as tough as old Castlevania games, and you can continue as many times as you'd like. Still, I found it immensely satisfying to start off struggling against a certain enemy, only for me to run circles around them a few hours later due to nothing but my own increased skill. I really felt like a god once I had all of the upgrades and was dashing, floating, and slaughtering my way through the levels. Then I'd hit a new enemy and get destroyed or at least severely wounded and have to regather my wits and tackle the new problem. The bosses, though, are different. They do require the pattern memorization, skill, and speed necessary for any good boss battle, but you don't fight them as often as you do normal enemies, of course. This makes each boss encounter a challenge, and more often than not, you'll die a few times learning all of their patterns. There's one boss I fought halfway through the game where I had to remain floating, using updrafts, attacking the boss, avoiding his attacks, and avoiding the projectile attacks of 2 turrets that could not be damaged. By the time I beat him, my thumb was raw and I felt like it was going to fall off, but I really felt like a total badass. Sadly though, bosses can be one of the most annoying parts of Odallus. Not the boss itself, mind you, but the fact that bosses are rarely directly after a save point. Usually, after each death, you'll have to run a gauntlet to get back to the boss. This can include tough enemies, spikes, and minecart sections with bottomless pits. It's extremely frustrating getting close to beating a boss, dying, and then by the time you get back, you're at half health again. The game also isn't as long as something like Symphony of the Night. It reminds me of Portal in that it's short, but the lack of length is offset by the quality of the game and the obvious love poured into it. Odallus left me wanting more the second it was over, and for anyone interested, it's available on Steam and GOG.com. Sadly, you won't see it on consoles just yet. The developers have said they aren't opposed to this, but I imagine it'll depend on how well it sells. I did have some problems with the game, mainly a crash to desktop in the first level, but it never occurred again and could have been my PC. Another issue I had while fighting a boss, one of his ice constructs remained even after I died and started the fight over. Also, this was pre-release code, so many of these issues could be fixed by a day 1 patch. Other than that, I didn't really run into anything that would make me hesitate to recommend the game, but I would have loved it if Odallus had offered true branching paths. As it is, there are dozens of secrets, but there's one path to the castle, with the branching paths only being cul-de-sacs where you'll find power-up items. Still, the levels are large, and you'll end up exploring every nook and cranny by the end of the game. Luckily, certain larger levels will contain a teleporter that will allow you to jump through most of the level once you've unlocked it. You can play the game with a keyboard, but it really is meant for a controller. I was using an Xbox One controller, and it read it just fine. In addition, you've got screen sizes ranging from default, ×2, ×4, and full screen. There really isn't much else on offer options-wise, though they did include a VSync option, which I always love and will turn on every time it's offered. I wholeheartedly recommend Odallus: The Dark Call if you're a fan of 8-bit style graphics or just great action platformers. If, however, length is your main concern, or you can't stand a game that isn't 3D with high-resolution poly shader 8 times whatever, then you might want to steer clear. I give Odallus: The Dark Call a 4 out of 5.